Come on in, bestie. Welcome to Story Pod, where we do the doing of story development together. Brought to you by Creative BFF. Hello, and thank you for joining me for this podcast. I have some thoughts that I wanted to share in a more organized way because yesterday I had a chance to kind of rant a little bit about something that I saw that I was disappointed in. And now I want to come and hopefully bring it to this podcast and to you, dear listener, in a way that can be helpful for the writing and not just a rant. There might be a little bit of rantiness in it, but I do want there to be a takeaway. And I have one thing that I'm going to focus on that it boils down to. So what are we talking about? Today, I want to discuss including modern politics and social and cultural issues in a fantasy or historical fiction context. And the reason that I want to discuss this today is because recently, as of recording a few days ago, the latest installment in the Dragon Age series, video game series, was released, Dragon Age Veilguard. And I have been a huge fan of this series since it first came out. The first game was what is one of my favorite games of all time, to the point where I have written cringy fan fiction for that game, and you will eventually hear some of that fan fiction. But what I've been seeing in the YouTube streets that I frequent is a lot of discourse around certain topics that they have decided to include in the game that are a little bit of a hot button issue right now for a lot of people, both people who agree and disagree with these issues, and that is trans and non-binary identities. Now, the Dragon Age series has always included alternative lifestyles and homosexuality and LGBTQ type subjects and characters, but this one, the way they are including it, feels very ham-fisted, at least from what I've seen. Now, full disclosure, I have not played this game. I had intended to play this game because I love this series, so I was excited that there was another one coming out. But I do have a friend of mine who is currently playing and streaming the game if you wanted to watch it. His channel name is Little Nerdy Xalen, Xalen. I'll put a link in the description. And I was able to ask him a little bit about what he thinks about how this is, the inclusion of this topic is going. And he hasn't reached the points yet in the story where that will come up. So I don't know how important these particular topics are to the game as a whole. I'm only going by the clips that I've seen of how these two particular scenes have been written, and my thoughts right now boil down to one kind of main best practice that I want to discuss with you. But first, I will talk about kind of what has been included. So the two scenes in question that have been kind of floating around the internet is one in which there's a discussion about a non-binary character and a little bit, now listen, this might sound a little petty, a little bit of self-flagellation on the part of the character who maybe made the mistake of calling this non-binary character she, because the character is biologically a female. And then the other is that there is another character who in the world of Dragon Age, I believe is a Kunari, which is a humanoid but not human race of people. And that character has a journal entry and a quest line, I believe, that basically surrounds them being trans, having a trans identity. Now, I'm going to approach this from the perspective of a writer and not, about whether or not these topics should or shouldn't be included in media or in your writing or anything like that. So please don't hear what I'm not saying. But the way that this is handled, the main thing that I want to zero in on is the fact that they used the terms non-binary and trans. And the reason that I was kind of ranting about this last night is because that immediately pulls me out of the world and drags me kicking and screaming back into the modern discourse that I don't want to participate in when I'm trying to play a fantasy game. Now, the Dragon Age games, if you're not familiar, now forgive me if I'm referencing the wrong time period, but they seem to reference, like, in terms of visually and the way the world has been set up, there's a lot of referencing of like medieval, Inquisition-y type time period, European type of stuff. You've got the armor and the castles and the way that the societies are set up religiously and politically and things like that. There's kings and queens. I mean, we have kings and queens now, but it's very much steeped in that era of our history. Now, of course, there are fantasy elements. There are races of beings that don't exist in our real world. So, we suspend disbelief, right? But because it is referencing a time in the past, using these modern terms that have only been around for a relatively short amount of time, an extremely short amount of time in this, in the scope of human history, you're pulling me out of the world that you want me to immerse in, right? And that is very disappointing to me from a writing standpoint. And honestly, it feels like lazy writing, because you can absolutely, and now this would be my suggestion to you as a writer, as a creator, if you're creating a fantasy world or a historical fiction and you want to include these types of topics, do not use, please, I'm being kind of absolute about it. Please do not use modern terminology around these topics. Find a way to describe or to refer to these topics that feels organic and natural to the world that you're creating. Now, because you're creating a fantasy world, because they have been creating a fantasy world, they could have absolutely come up with another term for trans and non-binary, and they could have even gone back in our own human history and into old, ancient cultures that may have writings and concepts that describe these modern things, but they don't have the words trans and non-binary. I believe that some cultures have used like the concept of two spirits, or, I don't know all of what cultures have, called this particular phenomena in human history. But go back, reference those things, see how those things have been described, and see if you can use or not use necessarily directly, because they may be very specific to those cultures, but see if you can find a way to do something similar in your story that will let the reader know that this is what you're talking about, but it also fits in the world, and the reader also gets the little bit of an aha moment, a little fun moment where they're like, oh, okay, I see what you're talking about. Whether or not they agree with this particular lifestyle or identity or anything like that, they can still have that moment of discovery, right, in your story. So I think that, unfortunately, from what I'm seeing, not having played the game, that the writers of Dragon Age Veilguard were so intent on including this particular topic, this particular subject, that they handled it, I think, in an amateurish way. And I don't want to be harsh, but I think it's lazy, and I think they could have done a little more work. Now, my friend did say that he would be interested to know what went on behind the scenes in the writer's room, and was there discussion about the best way to include this? Should they use the modern terms or not? And I would be interested to know if there was any discussion around that, or if it was just like, yeah, just throw in non-binary and trans. And I think that also, in addition to being lazy writing, I think that it also is not, I think it's, how do I want to say it? Not disrespectful to the audience, but you're not giving the audience any credit for intelligence to be able to understand the concept that you are trying to portray if you're not using the terms trans and non-binary. So I wonder, it's like, okay, well, are you specifically saying this because you want to make sure that very young people playing this game know what you're talking about? And that in itself may or may not be a problem. You know, you may fall on either side of the aisle of that. And you definitely may, you know, as a listener, you may fall on either side of the aisle of that. But as the writer, it's like, okay, do you want to make sure that it doesn't fly over the head of the youngest of your audience? I don't know. But so I can't even guess at the intent or the reasoning behind why you wouldn't make up a term because you're creating a fantasy world, or you wouldn't find another way to describe it. Now, I do want to bring in an example that I felt like this was done well, and that is in the game Horizon Forbidden West. And I'm not even going to try to describe the, what the game is about, so please feel free to go look it up. I have enjoyed that game series. I haven't finished playing the second one, but I did beat the first one. It's a lot of fun. The story is very interesting, and when you get to the moments where you realize, especially in the first one, where you realize what's going on in the world, it's kind of like a woo. It kind of shook me. I was like, ooh, this is crazy and thought-provoking. So I would recommend it. I thought the writing was good and the game was fun to play. Anyway, enough of that. On a certain mission, you go to a cliffside town. The main character goes to a cliffside, not a town, but a cliffside settlement. And of course, as in these games, there are side quests that you can do while you're doing the main quest. And on one such side quest, I believe it was a side quest, you are charged with helping one of the teens who is trying to do a rite of passage that would allow him to become a warrior or to join a squad of young warriors. I don't remember what they were called in the game. And this character is kind of like the underdog, and he wasn't expected to kind of be in this role in the society. He was supposed to take another role. But in any case, there is another squad of teens who are doing this rite of passage, which is that you have to climb a mountain, usually with a partner. And the leader of that squad is what we would recognize as a trans person. But because within this world, number one, there's no language, there's no word called trans. There's no hormones or surgery that you could do to change your physical body to align with what you believe your gender identity to be. This male character was just living as a female, dressing and living as a female, and the society around them recognized and accepted the fact that this character, although biologically male, was just living as a female. I think that the way they handled it was that there was a character, I don't know if it was the main character or if it was another character who asked a question around, why is this person, this man dressing as a woman. And they explained it. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a big thing. It was just like, oh, this person feels like a woman, and so he dresses like a woman. I don't know if he even used him. I think they just used the name. So they dress like a woman and live as a woman, and that's it. And it was like, oh, okay. And we're moving on. And so I was still able to immerse in the world. I appreciated from a writing standpoint that they were able to weave this concept into the world in a way that felt like, yeah, it makes sense. They didn't have a special word for it. They could have made up a special term for it, but they just explained and showed there's this character. And now, of course, this is not a main character or even a companion character. This is just a side character in a side quest that's not necessary to do in the game. But I think that the writers of Dragon Age could have taken, I'm not saying that they played or that they should have played this game, but there was just a better way, I believe, to handle this topic in the game itself that would not pull the audience out of the fantasy world and back into the modern world. And that causes, I can't think of the word. I kind of want to say something similar to like uncanny valley, but that's absolutely not what I'm trying to say. It causes a disconnect. It causes, we immediately can no longer suspend disbelief, because now you're telling me that this culture that has not been developed in the way that we have, or that has been developing from a timeline that is like olden days in our world, has terms like trans and non-binary, these terms that have come around within the last 20 years, or maybe more than 20 years, but definitely within the last 100 years, right? And now I can no longer, now I feel cringy. Now I feel irritated because I'm no longer immersed in the world. So my nutshell of how I would suggest, now listen, you're a writer, you do whatever you want to do, that if you're writing a historical fiction, or if you are writing a fantasy that's based on a timeline, or that you're referencing a time in history that these things would not have existed widely. Number one, first and foremost, not existed widely. And number two, would not have the same terminology around these terms, then please, I believe a best practice would be to create a different term or describe it in a way and show it in a way that makes sense for the world that you're in, that you're creating. Now, if you're doing a modern story, or if you're doing a science fiction that takes place down the timeline from our current time, technically, even if it's not like exactly our world, but it's down the timeline, we would recognize it as a future time. And you still want to use those terms, or whatever terms, even if it's not the subject of gender identity and trans and things like that. If it's another modern concept that you want to use, and you want to use the terminology, and it would make sense for it to still have carried on because it's in the future from where we are, or it's modern, then fine, go ahead and do that. I would still caution against being so ham-fisted, I guess, ham-handed or whatever in the way that you bring these subjects in. Because on top of the fact that Dragon Age used the terminology from today, which is my main point, my secondary point is that the way that it was included, at least from what we've seen in the clips, the conversation and the quest line that include these topics, they felt a little bit disjointed. They felt out of place in the world to give it this type of prominence. My suggestion would have maybe just been like, do we need a conversation around this? Do we need, for example, to have a conversation around the non-binary character, and the type of conversation being one in which one character mistakenly calls the non-binary character she, and then performs some push-ups, and then goes into a long, it's not excessively long, but like a description about some other unrelated person that they knew in the past, and this action. And see, they were able to create a new term around making amends for this, which is called, I think it called it pulling a barv, doing these push-ups, and she gave a whole explanation about why, and it's not connected to the story at all. There's no reason for us to really go into that history of it. So if you can create a term around that, why couldn't you create a term around non-binary and trans, right? So anyway, I just think that a better way to handle it so that we're still in the world is to just, if you want to include this, is to just have the characters be, There's no context for those terms in Dragon Age. So I feel like a better way to have handled it would be like this quote unquote non-binary character who is tasked or is part of the group that's going to be saving the world, I assume. They just, dress and act and talk and move and live in a certain way that is not overtly feminine and not overtly masculine, right? And that's just what they are. This character who is a woman, or is a female, because it's not a human, but is a female, but wants to live as a male, just make this character, make it that they just live as a male. They dress as a male, whatever. It doesn't have to be a big quest line, right? Because I feel like, why do we have the time when we're trying to save the world to go have this discussion and for you to figure this out? So those are my thoughts. That's how I would have suggested that it be handled if this is something that you want to bring in as a writer to your world. Think about the time period that you're referencing and the world that you're creating, and does it make sense for our modern terms for these cultural and social topics? Would it make sense for those to exist in that time? And if no, resist the urge to use them. Find another way to include it. Okay? That's what I think. But what do you think? Now, maybe I made you angry. I hope not. I hope you didn't hear what I didn't say. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. How would you have handled it if you're playing Dragon Age and you've reached the point of these particular scenes? How do you feel like they were handled? And of course, this is going to depend on, how you feel about it. Probably will depend on your worldview, right? So I would love to hear your thoughts. Let's be respectful about it. We can agree or disagree respectfully, because we're besties. All right. We're besties, and I will talk to you next time.